are all crushed by the unprovoked, brutal war against Ukraine. But we are not helpless. Our choices matter. Our businesses' choices matter. And there are things that we can do, and there's perspective to be had. So today, we're going to talk with the former finance minister of Ukraine to find out more about Ukraine as a country and about the business community and what the business community can do as more and more companies step up with their making ESG commitments and getting behind things, and you'll hear about some of the trends. But we want to find out what we can do as business people, as leaders, as consumers, as women. So listen up, grab your notebook and notepad or whatever you take notes on, because here we go. Welcome to the Electric Ladies podcast, formerly known as Green Connections Radio. We bring you insights and tips from remarkably innovative women about corporate responsibility, sustainability, and energy-related issues. I'm your host, Joan Michelson. We talk about innovation, leadership, technologies, and careers, always bringing a new perspective. Find us anywhere you like to listen to podcasts, on our website, electricladiespodcast.com, and through my Forbes blogs as well. And please pass it on to your friends, especially this week, because we all need to help. Quote, Russia's invasion of Ukraine must prompt an ESG reckoning, unquote. That is a quote from my guest today, from a piece she wrote in the Financial Times recently that I want to talk about today. Shortly after Russia attacked Ukraine, about 9 weeks ago, as we record this, Yale University posted a report on how companies are responding to the war. That is, which ones are staying in Russia, which ones are pulling out from Russia, which ones are doing something in between. And I wrote about that list then. Interestingly enough, a few of the companies I called out for their less than stellar positions subsequently wrote me and said, oh, by the way, Ms. Michelson, we've changed our position and we're pulling out. So you know what? It matters. Our voices matter. And now that list is up to 1,000 companies, which is really great. And these are, most of these companies are companies that have made protestations and commitments of net zero and ESG, and, we love our people. And some of them have not, but that's a good thing that that they're stepping up. But what I want to say today is it's not just up to the US government. It's not just up to the European governments. It's not just up to NATO. It is up to each of us and our entities too. So today we're privileged to talk with the former finance minister of Ukraine to find out more about how we can help. And it's writing checks, but it's not just writing checks. And I also want to say, full disclosure, my maternal grandparents, my mother's parents, were born in Ukraine and fled the Russian pogroms as children in the early 1900s. So I'd like you to meet Natalie Jaresko, who served as Ukraine's finance minister from December 2014 until April 14th. Those dates might ring a bell because they were just after Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. Afterwards, she served as executive director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, helping to guide the rebuilding efforts of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria completely devastated that country. So she knows about rebuilding. She knows about Ukraine. She knows about rebuilding. She knows about finance. She knows about ESG. We are talking to the right person today. Natalie also served in several economics-related positions in the State Department, U.S. State Department, interestingly, including coordinating activities from the Soviet Union and its successors with U.S. federal agencies. So that was kind of mind-blowing, including working with probably some people I know from OPEC, from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. She was also the first chief of the economic section of the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine. I could go on and on for days about her background. She also is overeducated, having had a bachelor's degree in accounting and political science from DePaul University and a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So welcome to the Harvard alumni team. Without further ado, welcome to Electric Ladies, Natalie.
And well, thank you very much, Joan. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So first of all, how are you doing and the people in your world? How's your family? How are your colleagues? I know it's brutal and I don't expect niceties, but seriously, how are you?
It's a hard question to answer. I think we're 70 days into this war and we're past the shock. We're past the sadness and we're into how to manage our energies to make sure that we prevail. The news is a mix of amazing courage, braveness, the fierceness, the devotion of the people on the ground who are waking up to bombs ringing day and night, air sirens, and atrocities. When the Ukrainian forces take back a city from Russian occupation, what's revealed is often inhuman. It's beyond what you expect in a war because we think of wars as primarily between militaries, where the exception to the rule is civilian being murdered, being attacked. And here, not unlike Aleppo in Syria, this is very much a focused attempt to eliminate the population of Ukraine. Genocide, extermination, use the word that you're most comfortable with. And it's harder to accept because we know people. I have relatives there. I have staff. I have former business partners. I ran a private equity firm for 20 years there. Factories being blown up, children being lost. I have friends who are in the civilian defense and in the military who we've already lost. We're watching today as they pummel the remains of Azovstal, the steel factory in southeastern Ukraine in Mariupol that holds about 500 civilians and about 100 the final military forces, whom they will not allow an evacuation, a humanitarian corridor to allow them out. They are bombing it, and apparently Russian troops have entered into the factory, and they're just going room by room. It's hard to balance. I'll be very honest with you. It's hard to balance. I'm extremely proud of the Ukrainian people for defending democracy and freedom, for standing up for that freedom, for being willing to sacrifice for that freedom. Sometimes we forget that freedom has a cost and that we need to defend it. They're reminding us every day. But at the same time, it just seems so unfair. It's a very peaceful nation, no territorial ambitions, no hatred for their neighbors, not even for Russia before the war. And so it's a tough time. It's a tough time.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's hard you have to kind of compartmentalize to focus on trying to get the solutions and negotiating because the pain is probably extraordinary. So what I want to do, though, is I want to give some perspective. I want to talk about Ukraine before the war a little bit. Tell us about the economy, the types of companies that were there, the types of industries, the commodities. We heard a lot in the news about wheat. Being a big exporter. So talk about your beloved Ukraine 9 weeks ago, okay, of what it was before the war started, what we're looking at so people can understand what's going on and what's been lost and what we hope to have, rebuild and come back.
So Ukraine, before the war, had spent the last 8 years since the war began and since the end of the Revolution of Dignity rebuilding. rebuilding an economy that over 30 years of independence hadn't necessarily been reformed properly, didn't go quickly enough, didn't actually utilize its potential, but it actually in the last 8 years started to really catch up with achieving that potential. So it became the second largest, once again, it became the second largest grain exporter in the world. Wheat, corn, sunflower oil, number one, taken all together, all the different grains, rye, barley, number two in the world, feeding over 400 million people outside of Ukraine, which is why you're hearing so much today about the potential for famine in countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea, countries that can't afford the increase in costs, and countries that rely heavily on Ukrainian supply of grain. A little less well-known, because Ukraine had, even in the Soviet period, and it was kind of known as being the breadbasket of Europe, but less well-known is the IT community, the technology community. Ukraine, at some point, had more PhDs per 1,000 people per capita than any other country in the world. The IT community is an extraordinarily robust and impressive group. It's given rise to, the founder of WhatsApp is from Ukraine.
Oh, I know that.
The role that the IT community has had pre-war was extremely important globally, but now they've become, during the war, an interesting new field of defense and even offense. So they've formed something called an IT army. And they organize, to be perfectly frank, cyber attacks against Russian entities, whether they are governmental, non-governmental. They interfere in the press to be able to show and expose the pictures of the true atrocities to the people of Russia who don't have access to freedom of the press. And so they've been doing a great deal. It is it's a very highly cyber savvy community. And it is a crypto community that is very strong. And they've raised substantial crypto donations because of that, because of their connections in the cryptocurrency world for the war. So there's the entire IT side of it. One element that people don't think of often and is that about 70% of the value-added neon gas in a semiconductor chip comes from Ukraine. So we had semiconductor chip supply problems during COVID. Those problems are going to be accelerated. And, we think that that's just computers, but it's telephones, it's automobiles. Semiconductor chips are critical to so much of our lives now. And that supply of value-added neon is no longer available. Ukraine is number 12 in the export of steel. And if Russia is also number 5, if you take that together, that means that steel costs, which translate into construction costs, increasing globally over time. Because Russia has suffocated and strangled all the ports, Ukraine's unable to export in the kind of quantity and bulk that it could with the ports. It will still try to export grain, for example, through the rail through Europe, but it's not in any way assured that they'll have a good growing season because the war is continuing throughout the country. So agriculture, IT, steel, and then interestingly enough, it serves as a major parts supplier to the automotive industry in Europe. So almost all the wire harnesses that go into European cars are manufactured in Western Ukraine.
Wow.
And so there are these elements where Ukraine has become a globalized entity. It is part of that globalized trade. And we're going to start feeling the effects of that over time as the economy is unfortunately, again, being suffocated. The estimate is about right now, halfway through the year, a 50% decline in GDP.
Wow. Yeah, I've spoken with several, I know a lot of people in the auto sector because I worked at Chrysler myself. And they've talked to me about, like, VW froze their operations there, and obviously many of GM, et cetera. And they've talked to me about that. I didn't expect that. That was really surprising, and how much of a hit. And they're also still paying their staff there, which I think is important, because that's a good thing. They could say, well, they're not working, we're not going to pay them, but they are paying them. And I think that's That's a good thing too. So we see pictures of life on the streets going on in Kyiv and in Lviv, anyway. And so are people making money now? Are people, other than the attack, the cyber attack people, the IT people? I mean, a lot of that is happening voluntarily, right? But are there merchants going? Is the economy going right now?
So it's
how much of it
amazing.
is going? You said 50% GDP loss, but
Right. That's primarily because your exports are down and your activity in eastern and southern Ukraine are completely have completely ceased. But anywhere where business can be done, it is. And that again shows the resilience of this economy. The banking system, about 70% of it is up running. The ATM machines are running. The currency is stable. When I was Minister of Finance in 2014, we had a massive devaluation. We had no reserves in the central bank to cushion that devaluation. We had a banking system that was collapsing. We had to shut about 150 banks out of 300. All of that work that was done in the last in the last 8 years to recover from that initial post-revolution and initial occupation and annexation of Crimea and Donbass in the east really helped to create the resiliency that you see today. So we did, for example, a fiscal decentralization, moving revenues down from Kyiv down to local communities. And what you see is local communities are engaging and acting. They're not waiting for instructions from above. There are mayors and governors who have become real leaders, really taking the responsibility and being accountable to their communities, but having resources. So the government's budget is not doing well because taxes are not being collected. And there's a monthly deficit of about $5 to $7 billion a month. That's just to make sure that they're paying the most basic essential services. They pay the military salaries, pensions, unemployment, and subsidies to the internally displaced people. There are about 4 million Ukrainians who have fled to Europe as refugees, but 6 million who have had to flee their homes to other parts of Ukraine. So these are the kind of medical personnel salaries. Those costs all have to continue to be paid, but taxes aren't coming in. So when the war started, something very interesting that Americans are often surprised by, the government asked for companies to pay their taxes in advance in March. And companies paid advance tax payments to keep the government going. But that meant that going forward, right, there weren't taxes to be paid. So yes, the economy is going. The government is even trying to get the farmers to farm. And so they're providing them low-cost loans for fuel and fertilizer, trying to get them out to plow the fields and do spring planting. But it is on and off. There is a program to move companies that were in the most heavily occupied or bombed areas to the center or to the west to keep them going. So there is a real effort underway to keep as much business going as possible. And what you're seeing is in the first month, there was a massive outflow of people from the country and from, for example, Kyiv, the capital. And there's a massive inflow. People are coming back. I have talked to so many of my friends who are calling me now from their apartments in Kyiv saying, I'm home. And if you haven't been there, and I wish everyone a trip to Ukraine when this war is over, Kyiv in May is one of the most beautiful places in the world. Chestnut trees, lilacs, hundreds and thousands of tulips, which were planted last year, so they're coming up. It is an incredibly beautiful city. And so people are going home if they can, which again tells you about resilience, about strength.
Yeah, what's been fascinating, and I do want to go after the war, what's been fascinating to me is the creativity and the resourcefulness of this. I mean, they're basically winning with bubble gum and rubber bands. I mean, to do things like create walls of tires to keep them at bay, and to just makeshift, weld together steel stuff you can find around to fend off the tanks, and to improvise, right? I did a story on what companies should do, and Pirelli was one of the companies that I called out for not doing enough. And I know the head of sustainability for Pirelli, and I said, the rubber's hitting the road here, people, and why don't, instead of building tires for Russia, give them to Ukraine and put up those walls? Well, so they subsequently said, guess what? We're stopping the supporting Russia. So,
well, the real differentiation between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, let's go back. I mean, Putin's mythology is that Ukrainians don't exist, that they're just some subgroup of Russians. But society is actually organized extraordinarily differently. Russia is a very top-down society where everything comes from the top, all instructions, all direction, all information. Ukraine is a very unruly democracy. And what I mean by that is civil society is extraordinarily active. President Zelensky, who is greeted as a wartime hero globally, wasn't a political. His political party was born when he ran for president. The former president lost to him with a 70% vote for a person who was a comedian before. And, the Ukrainians basically said to the last president, you didn't satisfy us. We're trying something new. And that happens all the time in Ukraine. And this civil society creativity. So there are websites for literally anything you want. If you want verified English language speakers to speak to the press, there's a site with all their bios. You can pick verified speakers. If you want to have access to video, if you're from the media, there are websites that provide you access to all videos. If you want to support women and children, you'll find something for that. If you want to support the media, independent media, there are groups for that. I mean, it is overwhelming. I'm the chairperson of Aspen Institute Kyiv. And on our website, we update it regularly to include everything every individual is doing to support the war. And it really, if you were waiting for instructions from above, it would never have worked. But it's 1,000 points of light, to use an old catchphrase. And it's creative. It doesn't run out of fuel because it's homegrown. It's everything from, grandmothers making food and sending it to the soldiers. I saw a photograph recently, the woman's home had been completely destroyed, but she had an outdoor oven and she was baking bread amongst the rubble to take the bread to the soldiers. Wow. And, there was a story, there was an artist who's passed away, an elderly woman, and she did naive art. She wasn't a formally educated artist. It was all just native to her. And she had a village museum where she came from. And it was bombed and it was burning. And the people in the village went in to save that art, to roll it up put it under their clothes and try and save it from burning. That's the level of engagement. It's at every human level, at every village. You do what you can do. When I talk to friends and when I talk to people, that's really the question. The question is, what are you doing? I'm doing this. What are you doing? Can I do something for you? Is there something I can do for you? It's really about doing something, whether it's making Molotov cocktails to throw at tanks, and then the military provides mapping of where you should throw it at a tank. What are the most vulnerable spots?
Wow.
It is. It's what's unique and different about Ukrainian society. It is a society that demands a great deal of its leadership, accountability, and happy to kick them out if they're not serving them. Try something else, try something new. But it is not a top-down autocratic society. And so Ukrainians know exactly what they have to lose if Russia and Russia's system and Putin's system is what they have to live by. Freedom of speech, eliminated. Freedom of religion, eliminated. I mean, one of the largest Mormon tabernacles east of Germany is in Kyiv. Mormons are illegal in Russia. There is one church in Russia, one official church. There are, hundreds of churches, synagogues, mosques, you name it, in Ukraine. Freedom of sexual orientation. This is a big part of why Putin says the liberal West is, dangerous. Ukraine has European values, and it's really come a long way. And so it's just very unique.
Well, it's what's interesting. What comes up for me too is part of, unruly democracy is kind of redundancy, right? Because democracies are inherently unruly. That's the point, because we have various points of view. But what's interesting to me is the creativity and the resourcefulness and this entrepreneurial spirit and this connectivity to each other, this community mindedness that you talked about. And that is, find a way, right? Just find a way. I mean, I saw a woman on TV who was literally in rubble, and she was talking about helping somebody do something or another. And the reporter's looking and going, but how? You're sitting there. She goes, I'll figure it out. I mean, it's just like mind boggling. So, with that being said, we need companies and businesses and business people and leaders to find a way to help. And you've written passionately and beautifully about this ESG, what you call an ESG reckoning. And I live in the land of ESG, as you know. You've said that businesses can't just do an ESG up to the point of being, when it's uncomfortable, they stop, right? And well, guess what? We're all uncomfortable. This sucks. So just, deal with it. So one of the things that you said that really struck me, and I want you to talk about this connection between the war and ESG and what companies can do, is you said, quote, the global business community must understand that nurturing, upholding, and protecting freedom and democracy is part of their ESG responsibility. It's not only in their best interest, but also in those of their increasingly noisy and numerous stakeholders, the people in the community you just described. So unpack that for us and make that connection.
So when I think about ESG, I think environment, social, governance. And I'm thinking, as a company, am I in those three categories operating in a way, in a place where I'm respectful of the environment, the social issues, and governance? And Russia doesn't fit any of those three categories. Russia is not keen on fighting climate change. Russia is exploring the Arctic in a way that is damaging for all of us. It is using mining across 30% of Ukraine. It has been bombing nuclear reactor plants, which, if the wall cracks, will be an accident 10 times the size of Chernobyl in 1986. They are not operating in that country generally, and now with respect to the environment. So if I'm a company who's pushing my sense of duty and responsibility, and I want to support, the climate change efforts, being in Russia does not fit that pattern. If I move to governance on the G, just to go quickly, it's not a rule of law state. There is no freedom of speech. There is no consistency in contract enforcement. One of the largest, most well-known American private equity leaders was arrested on the street a few years ago on Valentine's Day, served in prison, house arrest. Now he can't leave Russia. It's been years, and it's because he's been accused of doing an inside deal. I don't know what the truth is. No one will know. And that's the point. You don't know. So if I'm an investor in a private equity firm, or I'm an investor in a company, and human rights are not being respected, the environment is not being respected, rule of law is not being respected, how does doing business in that environment, how does that get reflected in my scoring on ESG? And so if, in my opinion, the war is kind of separate in addition. I don't think they should have been doing business there even before, but now with the war, with a clear statement of a defined genocide by not one, not two, not three leaders, it's not just Putin. And things happen every day. So the foreign minister the other day said that Hitler was part Jewish and that Jews are killing their own Jews. The things that are coming out of that leadership should tell us that is not where we want to be. That is not going to reflect on the values of our investors, our employees, our future employees. I have two young daughters, millennial, Gen Z, I'm not sure, but they don't want to work for companies that don't take ESG principles seriously, or at least work towards them. And, so what are these companies that are staying in Russia? What are they going to do to attract talent going forward? How are they going to explain themselves? And then there's another side to it, which is companies there are paying taxes. And I don't know if, your listeners are aware, but Russia's a very poor country. Moscow and St. Petersburg are very wealthy, and there's oil money, gas money. But generally speaking, the farther you go east, the more poverty you see. Roads, schools, homes. It's disastrous, to the point that some of these soldiers have been stealing toilets in Ukraine and shipping them back to their families via Belarus because they've never seen a toilet before.
Oh, God.
That means that those tax dollars that you're contributing are not going to the development of society. They're going to a war effort.
Or an oligarch's yacht. Yeah.
You're financing war crimes. If you continue to do business there, right now, you are financing the bombs that are raining on the heads. You're paying the salaries of those soldiers that are raping children, and they're being encouraged to do so. This isn't exceptions. It's the rules that they're employing. And I think that is something that, again, I saw a study from the Kiev School of Economics that they did for the president, and they showed that the public value, the share prices, the capitalization of companies that had left the war had actually increased, and the share prices and international capitalization of the companies that stayed had lost about 4%. It's, about 600 public companies. It may not be a large enough sample size, but I think it's something to watch. I really do. I think there is not just a moral, ethical issue. I think there's a financial issue. As you look forward, because sanctions are becoming so complex, maintaining your business legally, lawfully in Russia and not getting caught in sanctions is going to cost beaucoup compliance dollars. I don't believe that Citibank, I don't believe that companies like Mondelez, I don't believe the arguments of Koch Industries. It just doesn't make sense anymore. It's not the first 3 days of the war when people thought if they just didn't answer the question, it'll go away. We're 70 days in, this war expands with every day. And if you and I, as taxpayers in the United States, are going to fund the bill, right now the Biden administration's proposed a $33 billion package, we're putting our money into it. Why should these companies be earning profits on the other side of that equation? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there was a theory years ago, which you know infinitely better than I do, that globalization would breed peace. That companies doing business with each other, because they want to stay in the global economy, they'd play nice. And obviously, that has not proven to be true, as you've enumerated many countries that are, China and Russia being the biggest offenders of that. But there's also Syria and Belarus, and we could go on and on and on. So, the SEC just released proposed climate disclosure rules. And they've opened them up for comment. So are you putting in any, I'm sure they're going to be, get bazillion comments and who knows what they'll end up looking like, but it opens the door. Now I realize that this is this takes climate risk to like a bazillionth degree, but are you going to submit comments? I saw that you had submitted something to the corporate secretary of the SEC, but talk about how, because that's a way to really hold companies accountable and force them to disclose in a way that they can't hide. I talked to John Kerry about this the other night at an event myself. And he thinks it's going to make I didn't talk about Ukraine specifically, but he thinks these rules are going to make a big impact. So what can you use that vehicle, that opening? And obviously you have relationships, but that's a formal opening that invites comment that they have to take responsibility for knowing. Is that a vehicle? Is that a way maybe that other people can propose a comment that supports whatever, don't let companies who support Russia get away with it?
I think that's one of the things that we did was we pursued a petition at the Securities and Exchange Commission to force, it's called the Russia Disclosure Petition, and it forces everyone to disclose any and all exposure that they have to Russia, Russian entities, Russian individuals. And that rulemaking process has begun. The SEC has published a sample comment letter, and you can indeed go in and support. The idea here being, if a company, again, I've named a whole bunch, Gillette, John Deere, International Paper, Mondelez, they want to stay, and they believe that that's in their interest. That's fine, I suppose. I believe in free markets. If we can't convince them to leave and they choose to stay, then we as stakeholders have the right to know all of what that exposure is. So we can, as investors, as potential employees, as consumers, I don't want to buy Oreo cookies ever again. All right. I'm done with Oreo cookies. I will not allow my children, my grandchildren. I am done with Oreo cookies. And I'll tell everyone that I know. There are other cookies in the world. If you can choose, don't choose those. They continue to manufacture in Russia. So I think having that transparency of the exposure is critical. And if they want to say that profit is worth it, let the stakeholders decide. Tell us exactly what your exposure is. And so, yes, you can now go to the SEC and support or write a comment letter on the Russia disclosure petition that was submitted. It's a rulemaking petition, and it would introduce a universal disclosure rule. I think you can do it as well through what you described, the climate rulemaking. I think it's going to be a harder stretch to do it solely on climate. But I encourage everyone to look into both of these and to submit their comment letters and to say that you believe we, at a bare minimum, need that transparency. You said something earlier, Joan, about how, we thought globalization was going to make peace, and we thought that if everyone was participating, I think our naivete on that issue is partly been, it's how they abuse the system. Mm-hmm. The autocratic countries use the monies that they earned, the riches that they had, to then influence our politics. We don't have transparent enough campaign finance to know where that money's coming from. They used it to influence the arts. If you look at who some of the major sponsors are of our arts institutions, it's Russian oligarchs. It's Russian oligarchs at Harvard. It's at Oxford. They own football teams
in the U.S.
In the U.S. in UK, and we never required, for example, transparency and beneficial ownership. When I was in Ukraine, the G7 required that of Ukraine. We had to show beneficial ownership rules. Who is the beneficial owner of anything? You couldn't hide behind 10 corporations. We don't apply that to the United States market or the UK. So today, when we want to freeze an oligarch's assets, as long as he's covered it up with 10 different companies, we don't know who the beneficial owner is of a yacht sometimes, of a townhouse in the UK, bank accounts. It's all hidden. And we should require that transparency ourselves. We are fomenting a system where that money is ill-earned money is being used against us to interfere in our elections, interference in the French elections, the Brexit elections, interfere in our political systems, interfere in influencing us. And it's not just Russia. China does it, and others.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really, really good point. Just to put a button on it, you can send me the link to your Russia disclosure thing, and I'll put that in the show notes, and I'll disclose it in other places, because that's really critical. Just to close the loop on the climate disclosure rules, I think it can be tied in actually pretty neatly, because we can tie it into mining, coal, fossil fuels, okay, as well as the degradation of the environment. They're obviously increasing the risks of increasing climate risks by blowing up the damn country. Okay, so hello, right? And Chernobyl. I mean, obviously the nuclear plant. And by the way, the Russian soldiers left it because they freaked out when they started getting radiated. But you and I can talk about this forever. I have a couple other questions that I want to get some career advice from you. One of the interesting aspects to me of your story is that you played a pivotal role in the rebuilding of many places, including Puerto Rico from the ground up, which was devastated, albeit from natural causes, not from this horribleness. but it's illustrative. I mean, they've had to rebuild the grid. They've had to rebuild their infrastructure. They're trying, I understand, I think, to do it in a more eco-friendly way and using more renewable energy, et cetera. Are there lessons that you can think of from your experience with Puerto Rico that might carry over into how you might suggest for the rebuilding of Ukraine?
Absolutely. And you're right. Puerto Rico passed a law that would say, I think it's by 2050, they have to be 100% renewables.
Wow.
There's a required shutdown of a coal facility here. And there is a transitional movement from very dirty diesel fueled electricity to gas, and major RFPs being done for solar right now. So it is a move to green, and it is, as you just said, something that is a silver lining of a horrendous natural disaster. There are definitely lessons to be learned, so many, in fact. One of them is that you need a vision for what you want to rebuild. Mm. And we need to have a vision for the Ukraine of the 21st century. What we want, and I even want to avoid the word rebuild, revitalize. Because Ukraine inherited a Soviet industry that was horrendous in terms of energy efficiency, dirty fuel. It inherited housing that was extraordinarily energy inefficient, and not built for an individual. Soviet communities are just, depressing the way they were built, never with the individual in mind. It's part of Soviet communism's philosophy. And what we have an opportunity to do is not to rebuild what was destroyed, but instead to renew and revitalize a country and make it the 21st century use of green technologies. We can have green steel. We can have communities where we, are building healthy, nurturing communities where it's planned in a way that they are living communities with water and energy sources, multi-purpose. They're bikeable. They're breathable. We should have roads. We don't just rebuild the roads that they've bombed. We rebuild roads that have electric vehicle recharging stations throughout, and bicycle lanes. Biking is very popular in Ukraine. And there was never a bike lane in the Soviet Union. I mean, that just didn't exist. So we can rethink this using the best 21st century technologies to be greener, to be cleaner, to be more community oriented. We can have rooftops that are, green. You've seen these buildings in some cities. We can do that. And we can not only, bring people home. Another lesson from Puerto Rico is you're going to need to prioritize. So many people left the island after the hurricane. How do you bring people home? We have now, as I said, 4 million refugees that have left. We want to bring them home. How do you prioritize housing and infrastructure versus other economic elements of the rebuild, of the revitalization? And where do you build? There are questions, where are people going to resettle? In this case, they have wiped certain towns and cities off the face of the earth. There is nothing but dust. And so you need to do some serious urban planning about where and how you want to rebuild, how to use green space and new technologies. And it's a silver lining, and again, a very horrendous environment, but it can be done. And right now, I think that's going to be critical. We need to rethink how to renew the country.
Yeah, what comes to mind is the word re-envision. Re-envision the life. And frankly, it's also another one of the most remarkable punches in the nose to Putin, who thought he was going to have exactly the opposite response, right? President Zelensky, of course, has been masterful, as you commented, and I would pose it that I think he also has a law degree, doesn't he, by the way? I would pose it that his experience in the entertainment community is part of what has made his leadership so masterful, because he's nailed the communication. He's, to your point, he's motivated, he's inspired people, he's motivated people, he's brought all across the world, right? And especially, I don't frankly know how he's even making it because he must be completely exhausted and drained and under constant bombardment. But there are also a lot of amazing Ukrainian women. And I highlighted some in a story. That's why I wanted to talk to you. Talk about, I read somewhere that there's the United Nations Women Gender Rapid Analysis, or whatever order those words go in, that women do not have a seat at the decision-making table in some of these situations in Ukraine, and that therefore their needs are not being met as much. I've seen various women on TV from Ukraine and members of parliament, et cetera, and obviously the women helping the refugees, and you obviously had a leadership role there. So talk about the women in leadership in Ukraine and women's needs in general. I mean, they're being brutalized, and we know this, but at least they are among the first who are able to get out when people can get out. How are their needs being met? How are they coping?
So women are a very, very strong part of the backbone of Ukrainian society. Not often enough, as you said, at the table of the decision-making, not often enough, but very much right behind it if they're not at the table. And so you do have a group of very, very strong deputies in the parliament who have been traveling because they can go in and out of the country and because they're not all necessarily all serving in the military. Although many women are serving, we have a very significant female component of the armed forces in Ukraine, which is important to note. And we have for the past 8 years. But the deputies are doing enormous work globally to bring the story out and to communicate to people like Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi. I mean, one of the reasons I think she's there is the influence that these female deputies and the Ukrainian female ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova, has had in Washington. And she is extraordinarily well respected. I'm very proud I mentored her. She worked for me back in the 90s. And
wow.
She was my deputy minister of finance, and she went on to be minister and now is just one of the most extraordinary ambassadors for the country. I think when you think of the refugees, it's very, very different. And it is not normal. When you think about refugees, they typically leave in family units. When my families fled Nazism and communism in World War II, and my father was with his parents, he was as a child. My mom was with her mother. And here you have only women, children, and elderly, because the men stay back if they're of conscription age. And so being a refugee is much harder because your father, your son, your brother are back in the country fighting the war or volunteering or medics, whatever they do to support the country. Not that people are angry they have to stay because they serve with dignity, but the separation is hard. So I have my executive director of Aspen Institute Kiev is a young woman with 3 children under the age of 6. And it took me quite a bit of convincing to have her leave Kiev. She didn't want to leave. But I convinced her that, her ability to help, right, because everyone wants to do something, is going to be limited by the 3 children and their needs, because you're a mom and you can't ignore 3 children under the age of 6. And so she finally moved farther west, but then the air sirens 24 hours a day made the kids, just miserable. And slowly but surely, we moved her out into Western Europe, into Eastern Europe, and then to Western Europe. But one of the hardest thing is dad is in, serving, and, the kids keep asking for dad. And it is a tremendous sacrifice on the part of every family. The other thing that is extremely difficult is that women are being taken advantage of. Yeah. And I am grateful to every community in every country that is taken in these refugees, but human trafficking is a real, serious, and horrendous problem to have to flee your home, leave your family behind, and then to end up having, your passport taken away from you and forced into prostitution is unacceptable. And I know that it's not the average person that does those kinds of things, but it is just horrendous. And so now we really need to look at how to avoid the human trafficking that is coming with this number of refugees seeking a home, seeking a place to stay, not having a job, potentially not having language skills. And we're going to need, I'm on the Welcome.us Council here in the United States, welcoming the 100,000 humanitarian parolees that President Biden has agreed to allow into the country. And I think that's one of the biggest things we need to watch for. As sponsors sponsor people, they need to be vetted, and they need to be vetted not just for, an FBI track record, but they need to be vetted in terms of that risk, that human trafficking risk.
You mean that they have been trafficked, or that they are being trafficked to come here?
That the sponsor that's bringing them over is not, that has a regular job and, has clear financial ability, that they're not going to take advantage of these women.
Okay. That whoever is sponsoring them is on the up and up. Yeah. That's a really good point. Well, I'm so glad you said all that. And there's tons to talk about in that, if we wanted to, but just know that there are a lot of us that really want to do something and want to help and are helping in our own ways. I mean, it's interesting because I have people who complain about their gas prices, and I look at them and say, I just look at filling up my tank as a contribution to Ukraine.
I'd even ask everyone to understand that it's a contribution to maintaining our own freedom. And Ukraine is where the battle is, but it is holding back an autocrat who doesn't believe in our world, in our system. He does not believe in liberal democracies. He does not believe in the rule-based order that we established post-World War II that's allowed us to live, for the most part, in freedom. He does not believe that this will end with Ukraine, which means, for the American people, if we don't win in Ukraine, our troops may have to get involved. And, that's a very selfish thing to think, but I'm telling you that that's the next step. If he attacks Poland, the Baltics, he needs to be stopped in Ukraine. Ukrainians are willing to fight the battle on our behalf, not just on their own behalf, on our behalf. And so I would ask everyone to understand that the longer this goes on, the more the global cost, whether it's famine, whether it's migrants from Northern Africa and the Middle East going to Europe and slowing the European economy down further, the human tragedy of starvation and famine, whether it's, as I said, everything having to do with semiconductor chips going forward, whether it's steel. We need to help Ukraine prevail now, because the cost of this continues to all of us is going to be much, much greater than anything we're seeing now.
Yes. And as you say, it will continue. So to that point, what can we do? So far you've said, we can stop complaining about gas prices. We can go to the SEC site and file, with the Russia disclosure rules, and look at the companies that we support. I mean, International Paper, in a story I did, I said, well, instead of selling it in Russia, why don't you give it for free to the Ukrainian people, because they need it. And they're not getting it. So what can we do? What can anybody who is listening to us today do to help the cause in Ukraine with their business and with their themselves as individuals? Whether it's, writing a check to the Red Cross, which I know some people have mixed feelings about. They don't know whether it's really going to go there, whatever. What would you suggest? What do you tell people to do? I'm
going to start at the top of the pyramid. We're all citizens. This is a democracy. We need to let our leadership know that we support military support for Ukraine, financial aid to Ukraine. So you need to let your Congress people know. You need to write to your senators, your representatives, and the White House. We're going into a heavily politicized season pre-elections in November. We need to let the Republicans and Democrats know that this is a bipartisan issue for us as Americans. So number one, let them know more military support, more financial support for Ukraine. Second, yes, in things like the SEC, you can write, you can support these petitions, and I've sent you some of that information to share. The next level down is helping those in need in Ukraine. And I'll differentiate that from helping refugees in Europe for a moment. I think that there's been an enormous compassion, as I said earlier, for the refugees in Europe. The governments have welcomed them, the families, and the international organizations, from UNICEF to the World Central Kitchen, you name it. Everyone is there, and there's actually outpouring that is really, really compassionate and amazing. I would argue that the 40 million people in Ukraine need your help right now much more. And how do you help people in Ukraine? Well, one is you can go to the National Bank of Ukraine and directly help the government with social costs or military. There are two accounts. There are organizations, local organizations in the United States that have access to the logistics. And that's where the battle is who has logistics in the country to deliver aid? Most of the international organizations, including, unfortunately, the International Red Cross, do not. So it's a very rare occasion that an international organization has the ability to deliver in a war zone. Typically, they're in the refugee zones. So there are a few. World Central Kitchen is in the world's war zone. Ukrainian Red Cross is. Ukraine Caritas, which is a Catholic charitable organization. And then there's a lot of what I'll call kind of unbeknownst to Americans. And so what I've done is I've partnered with Rick Elias at Red Ventures, and we've established something called Stronger Than Ever. And if you go to strongerthanever.com, Rick is matching the first $2.5 million raised. And we are personally going to make sure that it gets to the recipients. And this is only humanitarian, nothing military. And we are going to work with my former business partners in the country, people who have distribution with the government of Ukraine in terms of knowing what medicines have recently been blown up. There was a couple of weeks ago, all the insulin storage was blown up. So for every diabetic. And you need to know and it's a changing list. So you need to be in touch with them. So that's an option. There is a group in New York called Razom, R-A-Z-O-M, with excellent logistics in country and ability to serve. If you want to help on the military side, there is the Ukrainian World Congress, which is helping with the civil defense, getting them helmets, bulletproof vests. There are groups of U.S. former special ops and Marines who are helping. There's something called the Mozart Group. There's a Ukrainian Freedom Fund. All these are helping former American servicemen who are either training in Ukraine and or have joined volunteered. And then aside from helping the 40 million in Ukraine, there are the refugees that are coming to the United States, the 100,000 that I mentioned. And you can sign, if you go to ukraine.welcome.us, it is an organization that was established by the Obamas, Clintons, Bushes, and Carters. They are the co-chair people. It was initially established for the Afghani refugees to be welcomed into our communities, to provide them jobs, and it's been expanded to Ukraine. And there are all kinds of ways you can help refugees. Doesn't mean you have to financially sponsor them. You can help them with jobs. There's a CEO council at this, and the head of Goldman Sachs, David Solomon, is the head of that CEO council to help them get jobs. You can offer language. There's an exchange if you have mattresses, people need mattresses, you have clothing, whatever you can do to help welcome them into our communities. And then, yes, as stakeholders, shareholders, investors, consumers, I urge you to look at the websites that exist that show which companies are leaving and which are not. There are such a wide variety. There's the one I helped set up, boycottrussia.info. I work with one called squeezingputin.com. There's the Yale Management Professors site that you referenced earlier. There is a half dozen of these sites. Watch what's happening. Act. Write to them. Ask them if they are continuing their operations. Boycott the products and make it clear that you're boycotting products. Stop the investment. That same type of effort with non-public companies needs to be made. So we often have investments in private equity or in traded mutual funds. We need to write to those managers and we need to say, we don't want our investments in Russian and Belarusian companies. We want you to divest. I did that with governors early on. All state public pension funds should be divested of any Russian, Belarusian assets. There are so many ways that you can, as a stakeholder in our society, make your voice heard. Again, starting from the White House and ending with Oreo cookies, there is a way to say we care and we can do something. We spent a lot of time, Joan, talking about Ukrainian individuals finding a way. Each one of us can find a way. And we need to take our inspiration, I think, from that grandmother that put sunflower seeds in a soldier's pocket and said, when you pass away on my land, at least flowers will grow in that space.
Yes. Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. So a couple of other resources for you that I thought of real quick. One is I interviewed Zainab Salbi, who's the founder of Women to Women International. She's now formed another organization with Jody Allen, Paul Allen's widow, called Daughters for Earth. And they have an aspect to help. They only help women. They help women entrepreneurs, but you can find it on my website, on my homepage. And if you want an intro to her, I'll be happy to make it. The other is, and this is kind of interesting, is Shirley Ann Jackson I interviewed. She's the president of Rensselaer Polytech. And I bring it up because they just launched last year the Institute for Energy, the Built Environment and Smart Systems. And they may be a really good resource for you to help with this revitalization and reimagining of Ukraine after the war on a host of levels.
I'd love an introduction to her. That would be excellent.
Okay. I'll be happy to do that. So we like to close every discussion. You've had it with advice for women. And you've had such an interesting career journey, just, compartmentalizing a little bit of what we've been talking about. But if we look at a map of Natalie's career, it's just been fascinating. And there aren't that many women in leadership in finance. I mean, we're happy Jane Fraser now has her mantelpiece, but still, it's hard. So I like to give career advice for mid-career women. So what advice would you give for a woman in mid-career, say at least 15 years of experience, who's educated, who's experienced, who knows what she does well, but who is ambitious and wants to make money, but wants to make a difference? What would you tell her?
I think today there are more ways to make a difference while making money than there ever have been before. You don't need to remain or stay in public policy in the traditional kind of government think tank world. Now companies are establishing entire branches, departments, foundations to make a difference. So we look at a company like MasterCard and what MasterCard is doing to provide financing in underserved communities all across America is really making a difference. And it's being done in a corporate environment. I think that what we've seen, and I've gone back and forth between the private and the public sector, and I'm at this stage where I'm beginning to believe right now that the private sector has more ability, capacity right now to make a difference than the public sector. Our government is strained. It is divisive. It is often incapable of talking to one another on opposite sides of the aisle in a way that I don't remember over the last 40 years. It's more divisive than it's ever been. And I think in business, we can tackle climate issues. We can tackle voter registration issues. We can tackle the issues that we care about, DEI issues. And we can do it in a way where we serve as an example, and then that can press and push our policymakers to understand that we're not going to take it anymore. So I actually believe that you should always follow your heart in your career. And the reason I say that is because it somehow, if you're fulfilling your passion, if you're following your mission, and if your mission is, to make the world a better place, then it leads you to the next job. And I'll give as an example. When the war broke out here, I was working in Puerto Rico, and I thought, I should have been in Ukraine. Why wasn't I in Ukraine these 5 years? I should have been working harder there. What did I do? And then I realized after about a month of the war that the experience that I got in Puerto Rico on the rebuilding was unique for many Ukrainians. And I was going to be able to add something back when the time comes in Ukraine that others may not have. And so I followed my passion in solving problems when I came to Puerto Rico, solving financial, fiscal problems, economic development problems. And it eventually is leading me back to the next challenge and the next space, because I followed my passion. I was mission oriented, and I believe that that's where you succeed. And I tell my daughters that, young professionals as well as mid-career. I think, the real success in our lives is when we step away and we've mentored, 25 young women, and we have established institutions that live beyond us, and we have changed something real in the world. I think that's when it's all worth it. And so I think follow your passion, stay mission driven. I think you can do that and make money by working in the corporate world right now. You don't have to be in the world of governance. Not that, if someone wants to be in government, that's obviously great, but I think there are more opportunities than ever to make a difference today.
I agree with you, actually. Here to that. In fact, I've done a story, and I'm actually doing a book about this to a degree, but that I think the private sector has really become the global problem solver, because it's the one place where everybody has to come together, no matter what your belief system is, to solve a specific problem. And that problem is external from you, but everybody's in the room, and you have to figure out a way to get along in order to solve the problem. You can't be bickering about, and there are ways to hold people accountable for harassment and all the other stuff, right? So it's really, really interesting. Well, you're an extraordinary woman. You're doing extraordinary work.
Thank you.
I feel privileged to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Honor.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Is there anything else before we close that you want to say to all of us?
Just do one small thing a day. Just one small thing. Donate a book about Ukraine to a library. Speak at a school. Visit a Ukrainian community nearby you. Tell them you support them. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's just psychological, but one small thing a day. Make a phone call to a representative, send a text to the White House. If each of us just does one small thing a day, we will win this war, and we will save the world from what I think is pure tyranny.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Natalie Jaresko, the former finance minister of Ukraine. Please know that we all send our best wishes to the people of Ukraine for peace and prosperity, and for speedy termination of this horrible brutality.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. So hopefully we now have more perspective on Ukraine and what you can do to help. You are not helpless. Tell us on Twitter what you're going to do to help at Joan Michelson, and tag me. I'm all over social media. And tell us anywhere, and speak up, hashtag stand with Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joan Michelson. See you soon.